I don't know when was the last time I was in such a formal setup. Maybe 2013. But thank you, Arijit, for the invitation. And actually, this invitation came out of a conversation that I had with Arijit almost after a decade later about the relationship between dissent and art, and also dissent in relation to his work, which is something that I have been working as a curator in the past 4-5 years or more, actually. The way we're going to go about the panel today is that the artists here are going to speak about their practice, and then we'll have a general conversation among ourselves, and then we'll open up it to the audience. Bear with us. It's a very exciting set of practices. Thank you. Who wants to go first?
Yeah, hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming and joining this discussion. I'm so happy to be part of this event. Thank you, Arijit and Sonal, Samarth, for organizing, bringing us together for today. And a big congratulations to the CFA team and Arijit and Samarth for this book. I very much look forward to reading it. It looks absolutely incredible. There's a few images that we got to see already. I'm going to go into briefly the book that I have worked on around the Shaheen Bagh protest. It's called Shaheen Bagh, A Graphic Recollection, and it's a small kind of diary-like book. I've been making non-fiction comics and graphic narratives for a while. That's how I got into making comics. I was very inspired by the work of Joe Sacco and others who kind of delve into graphic reportage. This book itself was actually, I think of it as an extension of what it means to participate and be present within movements of resistance. And already the conversation that's unfolded today is so much of thinking about not just what one single movement is, but how one finds exactly that word, that rupture to what is an oppressive regime, and the everyday silencing of the effect of that apparatus. So being present, if anybody who was at Shaheen Bagh sort of has an idea of what that space created beyond just questioning a law, it was also a space led by women, Muslim women from in and around Shaheen Bagh. Actually, if we could stop the slides, I'll kind of go through them just after I talk for a second. So, because I'd like to go through them in a bit. So I was at Shaheen Bagh, like many others, first at the Jamia protests in the winter of 2019, when there was police brutality against the peaceful protests of students, and people from the university and around, as well as from the rest of the city, kind of came in saying no more. And one of the, I think the third or fourth day while at Jamia, I'd heard that there's a protest led by women nearby, but I didn't know where it was. And it was actually the way that often happens in protests, these, conversations start, and there's somebody who is holding their camera equipment and was trying to go to Shaheen Bagh, and I followed that person. We started talking and followed that person to a space that I didn't know where it was. And reaching Shaheen Bagh, I mean, at the first few days was still a much smaller group of women. But what was palpable from the onset of the protest space led by women was that this is an absolutely different ownership of that space. And it had already been sort of barricaded by JNU students and others. And so it was the highway between Delhi and Noida was blocked up. But it wasn't a large group. There was no stage. There was nobody. There was no equipment, around. But there was this palpable sense of very sharp critique of what big laws mean for the everyday. And women coming out saying, also obviously triggered by the protests at Jamia and the violence, police brutality at Jamia, but also saying, now what? And, where do you hide? So I think those first few days, I actually started making these one-off posters, which were a bit like these calls to action posters saying this is also happening. And it's so powerful in thinking of what it means within home, within the life of students, when these big laws change and the effect of them. So, which is what these women were able to do, who were not organizers of protests otherwise, who are not leaders of movements, but are coming out and really being able to sharply make that critique happen. So, so it kind of led to these conversations happening, which otherwise weren't, because that space was created by the rupture of the forced equilibrium by what is a fascist regime. So now, if we could open out the images, please. And the first, so over the course of being actively there at Shaheen Bagh, what became, of course, after the first few days, it grew and is spread into not just being one Shaheen Bagh, but the many Shaheen Baghs. And slowly, friendships form and solidarities grow, and conversations of micro movements and micro unfoldings happen in the ocean of that larger movement. And so towards, I think, the third month or so of the protest, I was having these conversations about what it is that young people within the protests, what are they imagining? Because it's not just the CAA that's being questioned or the NRC NPR. It's also the idea of nationhood and who claims citizenship or who can, when you're being so forcefully told who is and who isn't part of the country. So these conversations are what extend, I feel, into the making of a book. And I would like to imagine cultural productions like this, whether it's theater or books, as extensions of the book. So the first image actually is with one of the people I met and became a friend, and I had many conversations with, Shahana, who's an architect and designer herself, and who studied at Jamia and then was working again at Shaheen Bagh, grew up in Shaheen Bagh. And she's imagining, what it is that she thinks of as a future within the country, and what claims she has towards, the nation as a citizen, and what, whether the papers hold true to that or not, from what her grandparents have or not. And so those conversations were, they unfolded into thinking of the larger politics through these like smaller conversations. So the book starts with that. And the next. And it's also about imagining public space. So through that, it isn't just about the protest happening, it's also thinking of what that location and geography is. And this is Shana actually talking about when her family came to Delhi and what it meant for Muslim families in smaller villages in Bihar and UP to dream of as coming to the capital city, and families who earlier, refused to move during partition, and what they imagined as, it meaning to be able to have home in the capital city. And also the politics around this, which is not in this image, but follows in conversation, is around where minority communities, especially Muslim communities, will locate themselves in Delhi. Why is it that there's Shaheen Bagh and Jamia, and those are what become ghettos? And what it is that keeps Muslim families together within the city. And this is something that has led to conversations after also the book. So, for instance, reviews and conversations that have come in while talking about this is part of is little tangents from the larger context of the protest and Shaheen Bagh as a location. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so it goes from the intimate details of how the experience of the unfolding of protests and, the violence at Jamia, what it meant for Shahana and her family at home. What are the details? What happens within the home? What are children and parents thinking of together when something is being watched on television, such as the violence that happened at the university campus, the safest space for students. And after that, to also, of course, the book being a way to bring together moments with hopefully some humor. Of how, when protests unfold, what are some of those moments that really like stay with you? And so women who, one wouldn't assume are going to be at protest, suddenly making these really cutting speeches, poems, also banners, and holding them up. And these are just like they're the flavor, I feel, of what happens, of the spirit that spreads like wildfire, which wouldn't happen through one text. Um, The other thing that I feel happens within the length of a book, for me, this was my first book length graphic narrative, is that one can hold multiplicity of opinions. So there is, of course, the younger generation and that imagination of India, but there's also older women, the nanis and dadis of Shaheen Bagh, and how they're thinking of what it means this time during the anti-CA protest for Muslims to be leading a protest, because it's different from the Babri Masjid or others when Muslim community can be told it's protest by Muslims for Muslims. So this protest as being a space where there were many other communities that engaged with the idea of citizenship, human rights, and nationhood. So that opening, but being led by Muslim women and by a minority community, and the politics of that location and leadership. And the next. Yeah, so the instances, I also feel that the length again of being able to work with a book means that you can pace out and have time to just also think of what it meant for women to sleep night after night out in the bitter cold in Delhi. And I hope that the length of a graphic narrative book can hold a bit of that sense that is not just festive and a celebration of democracy, but is really hard, brutal work. The next. So yeah, again, this is holding the book hopefully holds together. It's not a single narrative, but it is moments and memories of the movement. So while we have the old dadis and nanis, we also have young leaders from Jamia. And of course, as we speak, many of them are unlawfully incarcerated and are still in jail. And it is also a book that is in, remembrance and of the fact that we will not forget that these leaders, some of whom we know, many of whom we don't even, remember names of. The next. And of course, the Shaheen Bagh then within the book, and also as a thought, isn't just one place. It's spread to being many Shaheen Baghs in Delhi, but also through the country. So the book also looks at then where else movement spread and glimpses from, say, the south of the country and other parts of the country, and not just Muslim communities in these cities, but also minority communities joining in, because this is now a rupture that has created space for many dialogues that are required against a regime. And yet, like while there's these micro conversations, the book also unfolds into these what we call double spreads of the immensity of movements, of the fact that this is not one conversation, this is lakhs and lakhs of people who are standing up and saying, we have a voice too, and we are the ones who put the prime minister on a chair and we can take him down. So we come back to these large spreads, and we also come back to what I feel is important in graphic narratives, is space for a viewer, reader to also engage with the story and not just be given lots and lots of information, but have quieter pages, which are also about the art and the poetry that comes in through spaces of rupture. It created entire exhibitions, libraries, and songs and stories, and is very beautiful because it allows for this level of depth and beauty. So there are pages that also just have those silent kind of recollections of the beauty of what happens when these ruptures are created. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Ita. One of the questions we will revisit is to kind of think about how does a practitioner whose immediate reality is different from what we would encounter in Shaheen Bagh actually immerses themselves and try to bring through nuance narrative from the ground in some way, and what that process would have been. Maybe that's something that we should kind of come back to once we look at the different kind of narratives that will come in the conversation with everyone today. Somebody want to go next?
Yeah. Hi. Thank you for coming here, and I hope you get access to the comic. That's the second comic that I worked on. There's another one called Suit, which is published by Yoda Press in January. Yeah, I think I'll speak about my process, and then we could go to the comics. Oh, okay, cool. Do you have the other images that I sent you? Okay, awesome. Thank you. I just needed a little more variety, I guess. So yeah, I think for me, art stems. I mean, and that's most art. It stems from something that stirs you deeply. It's difficult to speak about something richly and sensitively and evocatively if you don't really feel it, and if it's not in your active purview of concern, right? When something concerns you, it's much easier for you to be able to really speak about it in a manner that can move other people. I think the biggest preoccupation for me when I've been creating graphic novels has been that of oppression, as we're aware of it in its different faces, and that of violence. I think violence has been something that's preoccupied me severely, and that's mostly after my experience in Palestine. I volunteered in Palestine when I was in college, due to the benefit of an exchange program that we had with Israel, and then we snuck across the border and managed to spend a month there. But I think understanding what severe oppression looks like, and me myself coming from all my privilege of being an upper caste male cisgendered upper class individual, it's been something that I think as an experience moves you enough to be able to truly understand what solidarity means, right? And I think that that discussion is something that began there. When I came back, I mean, Arijit was one of the people who was able to relate with that experience itself, knowing his experience interacting with Palestinians and their freedom struggle. And I think over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of work that's gone into just being able to delve into and understand these relationships that we share, because it's I mean, Uma Chakravarti speaks about this, that the three pillars of violence and the way they percolate out into society are caste, class, and patriarchy in the Indian society. Understanding the interworkings of these three has been a major emphasis on the work, and which is how this collaboration with Arijit also happened, knowing that we were speaking about the G20 and trying to document people's movements. So yeah, I mean, I guess this is one of the panels from the work. Or we could go to the next one. So yeah, when it comes to the process itself, I think there's been a lot of effort to be able to truly understand this aspect of reality itself, where there is a complete attempt to grasp what's happening in a manner that can be processed internally. And for me, considering that I resort to fiction, fiction is something that is that one means by which there can be hope that can be documented, right? You're building worlds where people can imagine a change in these relationships. I think I forgot who had told me about this, but the idea of the fact that being truly radical is the idea of making hope seem possible than despair convincing. And I think that's been something that has been at like the bottom line of a lot of the stories that I try working on. So we can move ahead from here. I think, yeah, knowing that I've also been, say, in some sense, like radicalized in the last couple of years, there's also been the opportunity for me, having been in college organizing around the time of the CA and RC, to document the visuals of dissent, right? When at least when we were growing up, when I was consuming literature or TV shows or whatever else children consume, I you don't really see the idea of protest and dissent, which is normally portrayed. Like, how is it normalized for you? And I think that's the hope that this brings as well. Like when I see the works of all the people who are sitting on this panel, that there's a certain normalizing of the idea that, yeah, if you don't agree with something, you step out there and you make your voice heard, and this is how you do it, and this is what it looks like. And that's been really hopeful. I think just being able to interact with these kinds of spaces and being able to make it real in a fictional sense, which also makes it real in the real sense, has been a part of the journey as well. We can move ahead. Yeah, so these are panels from Suit, which has been a much longer tussle, I think. Knowing that I myself am a Savarna author, coming in and documenting lives of comrades in the field who were extremely supportive. But then again, as somebody who writes fiction, who's imagining what a future could look like, I think that big question is that what you what are you really representing? Like, I mean, lived realities are things that better authors and writers from Dalit community have been able to represent, and there have been fantastic works by whether it's Anna Bhausate or Babu Rao Bagul, something that's been translated more recently by Jerry Pinto, who've been able to document these lived realities. I think what I tried bringing in to be able to alter that discussion is something about speculative fiction, which is something that I've also been trying to figure out the possibilities of. As a culture, I feel like we've not really been able to consolidate science fiction or speculative fiction. Like, we don't really talk about the future that much. And where do these problems go beyond today and now? And how do they manifest? It's not like it's going to be all great after 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. But yeah, that's an attempt to think about what the possibilities of the future hold and bring about these conversations, because these problems that we carry with us, which lead to violence, are things that will manifest into the future as well. So yeah, we can move ahead from here. So yeah, again, documentation of people's movements and trying to normalize the idea of protest as something that you do. Like, civil disobedience is totally normal and you have to do it. Yeah, we can move ahead. This is some other stuff that I've been working on alongside. I think it plays into that part of being able to really immerse yourself into a geography. I mean, I feel like there's a tendency, especially when you're in design school, or I mean, like coming from my own background, you tend to go and do your research and you come out thinking that I'm going to make a fantastic story out of this. But what is it to really be able to bring in the self and immerse yourself into a space, right? So some of these explorations for stories that came out of the time that I was in Malvan, living with a fishing community there. I was mainly trying to understand the relationship between my friends who were marine biologists, and even marine biologists in a third world context have their own nuances. They have to rely heavily on the fishing community because they don't have enough funds to be able to take their own boats and go out. And so trying to understand what that relationship between academia and lived realities with regards to a natural resource like your fish stock, and also, I mean, diving much deeper into those relationships has been something that I've been very interested in. And this is something I'm working on as of now. But yeah, that's about it.
Thanks so much. One of the things that we can come back to is, and I discussed this with you, is the idea of this fiction and how fiction helps you access parts of reality that you otherwise don't have access to, or maybe tell the truths that you can't really otherwise tell.
Yeah.
Maybe that will be something that we should come back to in relation to everyone, whether fiction is something that's the space of both engagement and comfort. Ikroop, do you want to go next?
Hi, everyone. It's lovely to see people here on a rainy day. And it's amazing, the work that I've seen of Arijit. It's kind of like makes me feel like an imposter sitting here. Also, the beautiful work of my co-panelists. So I kind of echo what Samarth has mentioned about kind of using this medium as a way of exploration of the self and kind of delving deep into personal politics, kind of surfacing in this process and becoming radicalized in a way. Yeah, I'll just begin with giving you an introduction of the kind of work I've done. So recently, during the farmers' protest, that is when I was working on Bhagat Singh, the graphic novel. And this was a graphic novel that came through my publisher, who asked me that, would you be interested in doing something on Bhagat Singh, since you're from Punjab and, maybe as an identity, like this will be more familiar to you. And I told her that honestly, I had never thought about it. It wasn't something that Bhagat Singh had never kind of crossed my mind. I had assumed him to be this hyper-masculine figure, which had been appropriated by the left and also the right. Very interestingly, they also think that he's their spokesperson. But then I kind of rethought about that and I said, yeah, maybe the lens of a woman talking about something, maybe something else will emerge. And it did. So while the farmers' protest was going on, I was working on Bhagat Singh and reading up on the history of Punjab and the number of mutinies that Punjab has been having for the last over 100 years. This was a poster that emerged during the farmers' protest. It was published with Karti Dharti, which was a women-led publication. The people who published Trolley Times got in touch with me and asked me if I would be interested in making a poster for them. And I was like, of course, I would love that. I mean, I would love to be a part of the farmers' protest in any way. So this is a painting from Amrita Shergill, the three women. And it just kind of struck me as though, when I'd seen the painting the first time, I felt that these were docile, homely women. What would it be like to put them on a tractor? That's the changing face of Punjab. And when I did that, everybody got really excited. I mean, so did I. I felt like, wow, I had cracked some concept, which... So when I did... it was posted across the protests and... can we go to the next one? So I'm just going to jump between my work. Okay, because I didn't label my images, one after the other. So I'm just going to, this is a panel from, this is a page from Bhagat Singh. And this is a conversation or an argument that Azad had with one of the HSRA members about not putting up a picture of a Hollywood maiden in their headquarters. He said that, this is like you're corrupting the place. And this is my lens of a woman, I suppose, where I felt that this conversation around beauty and corruption and how feminine beauty apparently is supposed to corrupt. I wanted to highlight this conversation as I read it in one of the books that many scholars, I had to do a lot of research. So I read a lot of scholarly articles, and in one of the books, this conversation was mentioned. And I said, yeah, this needs to be highlighted, how Azad felt that a woman on the wall of a headquarter kind of reduces the cause of what they are doing. And this other member said that you cannot destroy beauty and claim to be free. We are fighting for beauty. We are fighting to make the world beautiful. And if you are going to tear up beautiful women that have been posted on the wall, then you are actually fighting against the cause of beauty. Next, please. This is a famous photograph of Chandrasekhar Azad once he was gunned down in the park. And I took this photograph and I wanted to give it a more ethereal quality because he chose to shoot himself. So it was a suicide. It wasn't it was an ambush, but he chose to die on his own terms. So this is a kind of my homage to him, almost giving him a spiritual, enlightened kind of changing that very morose, dark photograph into something more, I would say, spiritual in some way. Next, please. This is the cover of the book, and I chose a Bhagat Singh who was 12 years old, holding a jar of mud, um, wearing a turban, kind of like changing the idea of Bhagat that we usually see. He was a young boy once, and he was vulnerable and confused and naive. And this is when he ran away from home, went to Jallianwala Bagh the day after the massacre, collected handfuls of blood-soaked dirt and put it in a jar and brought it back home. And I was like, this is a story that I've never heard of. I didn't know this about Bhagat. And so I wanted to kind of reel people in through this idea of changing identities of Bhagat rather than just, that one image that we see of him. Next, please. This is after Bhagat was hanged. In one of the books, Kama McLean, the author who has written this phenomenal book about that particular period in time, apparently a lot of women, it was the first time Indian women came out in numbers that it was unprecedented. And again, I was like, yeah, I need to bring out the fact that in Karachi and Lahore, the number of women on the streets mourning and also fighting with the same excitement that Bhagat had, passion that he had. I felt that I needed to kind of highlight that. Next, please. This is one of the first pages. So this is my introduction to Bhagat and the place where he was born. It was a canal colony, which had been sectioned by the British and given to Punjabi farmers to farm. His father was a landlord who would give out his land holdings to on rent. This is just my way of like bringing in the agrarian background that he had and rooting him in a history which again we kind of tend to overlook. Next, please. This is a panel from Jallianwala Bagh, Bhagat putting in the mud. This is there was a well in Jallianwala Bagh. I'm sure we are all familiar how people jumped into the well. So I just combined the two concepts and yeah, next. So there was clearly there was a lot of previous one. Yeah. I was reading a lot of leftist writing because Bhagat's main stay of his intellectual rigor came from communist thinking. And one of the magazines that I came across had a picture of two farmers who looked very Russian. It looked like a Soviet illustration, but they had been given these Indianized, almost like a filter where, they were wearing turbans and shaking hands. So I changed one with Bhagat and I kept the other farmer. This was for the farmers' protest as well. Next, please. This is one of the first images that I got excited to draw during the protest when Navdeep, one of the young men, had this big leap and it was published in all the newspapers of him jumping onto the water cannon and turning it off. This is called Chhal. So my radicalization happened kind of on accident because I'm so, I guess, deeply rooted in Punjabi culture that when I saw the number of farmers who look like people I would know, my uncles and aunts, it kind of brought in this change on a molecular level. I hadn't seen anything like it, and I had never been so politically tuned into protests and dissent. Although Jamia and Shaheen Bagh kind of lit a fire, and when the farmer protest began, it was just all-consuming. I felt like I had to participate in whatever way I could, and drawing is my medium. So this was the beginning of that. Please. This is the second illustration for the farmers' protest. Apparently, my uncle peed on a tear gas shell in the early 90s. And it was a college protest that they were fighting against the government about some fee hike. And so I was amused and also amazed by his ingenuity, how he, it was such quick thinking. And I was like, I need to put this out there. He was arrested for peeing on the gas shelf. And his father refused to bail him out, said, "You've embarrassed me. Your photographs are all over the newspapers." So my grandfather went and bailed him out. Yeah, next, please. This is also inspired by the farmers movement, where there were these two theater people, bhands. They're called bhands. They're Punjabi theater, rural. They kind of tell stories. They come up on stage and they sing these songs. So one of them sang this song about a scarecrow telling the farmer that he needs to keep fighting because if you don't, then your death is imminent. And this was just a poster that came out of that. Yeah, let me remember it first. जेतु कीर्तिया डर गया, डोल गया, फिर तेरी मौत यकीनी है. Yeah. If farmer, you lose your balance, you are certainly going to die. But my Gurmukhi, the farmers' protest was another way of me, getting back into reading Gurmukhi. I hope to get better at it. Next, please. This was another protest poster for the farmers' movement, where we tend to forget women farmers and they seem to kind of recede into the background. And this was just a reminder to bring them forward. Next. This is an image from the graphic novel of the Pagdi Sambhal Jatta movement that happened in the early 1900s. Ajit Singh, Bhagat Singh's uncle, was a big part of... Yeah, okay, there may be some repetitions. Can we go to the next one? This is Firoz Shah Kotla, where the last HSRA meeting happened. Okay, these are we can just cycle through the images. That's okay, I'll let you know. Lahore was the main place where the entire, I would say, communist headquarters and revolutionary radical thought was coming out of Lahore in the early 1920s to 30s to 40s, something we tend to forget. And this is one of the images highlighting that. Next, please. Just some architecture that I kind of put together of Lahore and what it... Lahore is almost a mythical city in my mind because it's so inaccessible. And when I was reading about it and thinking about how it's only a few kilometers from the Amritsar border, that it's remarkable. Next, please. This is another image. I would explain it, but I feel like maybe if you guys read the book, it'll be simpler that way. Next, please. Yeah, next. Bradlaugh Hall is in Lahore, which is where Bhagat Singh spent most of his formative years in his intellectual. It was a college set up by Lala Lajpat Rai. It was a very radical way of introducing education, where students weren't given any curriculum. They were just handed books, and certain parts of it were to be read and debated on. And there was no guru shishya, something which carries on. Teachers were addressed by their names. I feel this was like one of those pivotal points in... I wish we could replicate that currently in educational institutes, but we are still far away from this model. Next, please. This is another Lahori moment for Bhagat. Next, please. Next. This is some leisure, like Ita said, quiet moments in the book about, them just spending time. Not everything was action. There was time to spend and, pluck mangoes. Next, please. This is Kanpur. Another very interesting facet of Bhagat's life happened there. Next. This is the murder that took place when supposedly Bhagat shot a British official, and there is really no proof. It's just that he never defended himself. So there is really no proof. It's just some random testimony in court that they brought up people, and he was implicated for it and hanged. Next, please. This is the only time I insert myself in the graphic novel where I kind of give a comparison between the Quit India movement being withdrawn very suddenly and the impact it had. And I compare it with demonetization and Modi's, sudden withdrawal of currency. This is me inserting myself, like, kind of giving a framework of how I would kind of compare the two. And yeah, next, please. This is Jallianwala Bagh. Next. These are Gadri Babas. They were the Gadar movement heroes, but this is a picture from much later. It's 1930s. Next, please. This is a English version of the same poster. And that's it.
I'm kind of excited that you're on a first name basis with Bhagat Singh.
Oh, yeah.
I wasn't expecting that. But I think one of the important things that at least I felt was how revolutions are often gendered, or also movements are gendered. And I think we are at a very interesting moment where that thing is radically shifting. And I think it's also interesting that you, on the one hand, did a work on a revolutionary who's like the projected as the hyper masculine, and also at the same time have like something like the posters that you made for the farmers movement. Vidyun, would you like to go next? It's the perfect segue to you.
Yeah. It actually kind of is. So I was actually asked to speak about my work, Haq, which was on the women of the farmers movement specifically. I had sent that PDF, no? So if we can just show that. The one that says panel discussion. Yeah, so this is the comic. I have got my notes on a paper because I'm a very nervous public speaker, so please don't mind. So when Arijit called me a few weeks ago to invite me to this panel, he said that he wanted me to speak about my most recent comic, Haq, which is, as I said, on the women of the farmers movement. And Aditya also requested that I think about where the journey began and where it ended up. And so I'm going to try to put both of these together and contextualize the work. I think with the farmers movement, the first instinct to go was actually born of curiosity. I didn't understand the farm laws or agriculture. Can I have the next slide? Agriculture very well at that point. I wanted to go out of solidarity with their resistance and the difficulties they overcame to come to the borders of Delhi. And I had been engaged with the anti-CA protests through poster making and publications and different workshops, and mostly at the Jamia protest site. And in fact, Drawing Resistance, the publication that was developed, that I think Arijit had mentioned when he gave my bio, that came out of the anti-CA movement and the work that we did there. So that experience of being part of a movement kind of washed away a lot of pessimism that had accumulated in the recent years. And one didn't really need to have like a very clear reason to visit. I felt like a desire to support was enough to start. Can I have the next slide, please? But my commitment was kind of solidified early on when the misinformation and hate speech against the farmers movement took on a very familiar form to me, where everyone here, I'm sure, is well aware of the attempt by the IT cell to brand the Sikh members of the movement as separatists and in their vocabulary as terrorists. And when we went to the protest, we saw people holding up signs that said, "I am not a terrorist," in opposition to what the IT cell was doing. And this reminded me of photos I had seen of the Sikh community in Calcutta, of which my family was a part, and protests that they took out in the 80s, holding up very similar signs. And I had also just worked on an illustration project on the immense machinery behind misinformation in India. So it was very clear how an anti-minority narrative was kind of being whipped up to distract from the very real issues that the farmers movement was was raising. Can I have the next slide? So the resonance through time of the vilification of minorities was something that really struck me, and coupled with the knowledge of how misinformation machinery works, I felt I could and I should also contribute something by using drawing and text, because that's what I could do to talk about this movement and what they were actually trying to talk about. And I did a few posts on social media, which you can see. There's one portrait and one illustration inspired by Mahila Kisan Divas. And I did my best to keep visiting the protest sites and talking about it and kind of posting about it. But then when the Chief Justice of India made this ridiculous remark that kind of infantilized women and elderly people and said that they were being, quote unquote, kept at the protest site, I felt it was important to do something longer. Can I have the next slide? So this was for a few reasons. One is, of course, as many of us here would know, women across the country are not recognized as farmers by the government or by society. This is despite the fact that they do much of the work on farms. So why should they not have a voice, and why is the judiciary treating them like second-class citizens? That's actually the first page of the comic over there. Another reason is that over the months that I had been to the protests and spoken to people, I had seen and spoken to many women who had a very clear idea of why they were there, the issues that were plaguing farming in India, and how specifically they would be affected by the laws. Can I have the next slide? Thanks. So this was clear evidence that they were equal stakeholders in the movement, and I felt that really needed to be brought out. And it needed to be documented as a very direct counter to what the CJI had said. So I find it quite ridiculous that we even have to say these basic things, but here we are. And this was the basis of the comic Huck. This is why I did it. This is the backstory. So then I started going to the protests with an intent to talk to women there, either through chance encounters, or through more formal channels of going through unions and speaking to people in unions who are mobilizing on the ground. And it was through these conversations that I actually learned about a range of subjects related to agriculture and food rights, which I really didn't know anything about before that. For example, the threat of corporatization of agriculture, the way WTO has forced unfair trade agreements on farmers of poor countries, the link between what is procured by the government at mandis and the public distribution system, the struggle for the Tisra Hissa of Panchayati land by Dalits in Punjab. So all of these things were things that I didn't really know about before. And I understood these subjects, and my understanding in these subjects was grounded by the people, and specifically the women that I met there. Since the movement was still on at that point, can I have the next slide? Yeah, since the movement was still on at that point, I kept the narrative thread of the comic very close to the issues related to the movement and the details of how women would be affected by these laws. This is also because I wanted to convince the unconvinced and get them to understand why the movement was important. By the time I started working on this piece, the farmers had already been at the borders of Delhi for 3 months. By the time it was published, it was 10 months. So, and countless lives lost. So there was an urgency around keeping it specifically to those core issues. I think ultimately the person who was most convinced by what was said in those interviews was me, because I continued to work with Arijit on a project on corporatization of agriculture, and it's become a part of my interests now. And it's important to mention that though this chapter of the movement was suspended when the government was forced to take back the laws, the struggle for economic rights of farmers and farm workers is still ongoing. And there are many other battles that are being fought for MSP, for a PDS system that can I have the next slide? Sorry, just skip this. Yeah. That's the first page of the comic. For a PDS system that can actually nourish the people who depend on it. And also, of course, for the justice of the victims of the Lakhimpur Kheri massacre. And it's really telling how the state has handled that. And there's a disregard to the words, the lives of minorities, that is institutionalized quite openly. So basically, to end, I want to say that, and kind of resonate with something that Ita said about libraries and spaces of learning. I think in these movements, I feel I've certainly benefited from that. And I think that anything that I have done over here is kind of a contribution to that spirit and to that practice of the libraries that came up at both the anti-CAA movement and at the farmers' protest. That's it. Can you just run through the next couple of slides? Because I forgot about that. And those are two pages. And then the next one. Yeah, and that's another 2 pages. That's the last panel is where I kind of inserted myself as well. The only part where I've inserted myself, mostly because I didn't know how to end it. And I felt that was the only thing to do was to be honest and be like, I don't know how to end this. So here it is. And then the last panel, last photo that I wanted to share, which was supposed to be there while I was talking about libraries. This is from Shaheen Bagh. And I felt that that was a way to kind of, I like that this was on that foot over bridge where you can see the stage. Yeah.
Thanks, Vidyun. One of the question, just now we have a general conversation and then we'll open up for the, one of the most, I would say recurring things is that how do all of you as practitioners are trying to engage with maybe realities not that are immediate? I'm not saying not belonging to you, you're in the same country, but something that's not immediate and something that you have to negotiate both as from a subjective position of where you're from, something that some might talk about, you know, how does a Savarna person kind of make a comic about something that's not their own lived reality? I think one of the things is that how do you then negotiate in a very politically vocal space that we live in today, with being a chronicler, with being a comic artist, or somebody who eventually becomes part of the struggle or the movement. And how do you, because I think each of you in very different combinations have dealt with this, felt very strongly like Ikroop saying that, you know, and just to kind of join that to the word radicalized was used quite a few times. And I want to kind of spend a minute to think about what is radicalizing. Does it mean that me as a subjective position about what's happening outside and me making an effort to take a specific artistic position around that crisis or movement and so on. So I think it would be nice to reflect what does actually radicalizing means in a very like a real way, whether the social movement triggered you to be more politically awoke, or and also the process of how you went about negotiating your own subjectivity. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a question that for me was there throughout the process of working on the book on around Shaheen Bagh. Was this 2-3 questions that go together. One is about, you know, who am I within the story and as a participant, also about the politics of representation then, and what the, you know, just the dynamic that is created once you start representing and drawing page after page, and this thing gets created that's now separate from the idea of it and has a life of its own. So I think the beginning of like just this is a bit about participation. I feel like, so for me, I was at JNU as doing my MPhil, and during the time that I was at JNU, 2017 was when the administration actually started cracking down on, the basic functioning of the university and started making it really difficult to be able to do the basic work of teaching and learning. And against that, there were these lectures that started in the open in the administrative block, and maybe some of you were there, but they were about what nationalism and what anti-national means. And suddenly it created not just a rebuttal to what the regime and the administration, the puppet vice chancellor is trying to do, but created a space which could do a lot more. There was suddenly a lot more dialogue that was possible, and there were people coming in from, not just the university, but others were invited in to speak, other students. And so this kind of spirit of being able to open space, which doesn't then anymore belong to one person or one community, but is initiated by a community, is really, really important for me to think of as being able to enter, not just as somebody who's passively viewing, but in the capacity of a citizen as a political entity, and then as a responder with whatever one responds as, So if I'm drawing, and I think Ikroop also said this, of I draw and I write, and that's what I'm going to do. And silencing voices is the worst thing that can happen within the slow everyday functioning of a fascist regime. You slowly silence. And that's a silencing not just of the voice of minority communities, but all citizens. So it begins with solidarity. And I remember that this is a protest that's led first and foremost by Muslim women at Shaheen Bagh. But it is not only Muslim women at Shaheen Bagh. The CAA is a question about citizenship and about nationhood and about human rights. And so this bit about participation is complicated because it isn't just about one community at the end of the day. It is about the constitution. It is about India, and we are political entities unto ourselves and as a society as a whole. So I think I remember that, and it has been part of, also the education that I've had, and being part of various movements and protests in Delhi, which was so much more. There's always protests at Jantar Mantar. There's always ongoing movements from one to the next. So it is not new for Delhi, but the silencing is new. And also the strange, apathy that sets in within the young, who Arijit was saying that, the younger generation today are very aware. There is a hyper awareness, but there's also a strange sort of silencing that happens because we're able to just, do voicing of one opinion in our personal bubbles. So when a space like Shaheen Bagh is created first, it becomes really, really significant to be able to join this and add voices in many ways. So drawing and writing is one, and there were theater productions, there was poems, there's many ripple effects and unfoldings that will continue to happen. And those echoes will continue to happen. So I think that question was there, and it doesn't have an answer that answers away the question of who can tell whose story. It should be a question that stays, but it shouldn't mean that one is silent. So it's a complicated space, and I think that question stayed. What it practically leads to in some of the strategies for me was that these are people I'm interviewing at Shaheen Bagh. For example, the character Shahana, others who run, let's say, this NGO, Ibtida, which was, working with women and also going into other localities, not just Shaheen Bagh, and talking to women, bringing them sometimes to the protests so that there's more solidarity. It meant taking drafts of the comic back to people, because that's something that is possible. They're people speaking, the Shaheen Bagh is, the demographic is very wide. The people I was speaking to, some of them speak in English, and the book sadly is only in English right now. But at least that draft I could show, and that was important to me. I wanted to be able to have this book not just be, mine alone and my ideas of what is represented and whether that's okay. The people I can show it to, not just people within Shaheen Bagh, but also Ghazala Jamil, who's a scholar of Muslim women's rights in India and teaches at JNU. For her to be able to look at a draft before it came out and also write the foreword to the book, which for me was important, was part of how I think this comes together. So I do think that isn't, there are many ways that it could be, but for me, this was one of the ways that I felt that I can understand whether this has come together or hasn't, or there are parts that has, there are pages or conversation about the law or about what it meant to a certain place, or about the difference of the Shaheen Baghs that were outside of Delhi vis-a-vis Delhi. So these nuances that I may miss, and doesn't mean that I can't talk to people before it comes out. They're there. There are people who want to look at this. This is not a book that is just my opinion, even though I'm within it. So I feel there are these strategies and about thinking through the politics of representation that can happen in the process. And so those, I think the arguments and those conversations stayed with me through till the end. And that's important. They have to remain at the surface, but it can't be, the reason why one doesn't engage.
Thanks, Ita. Samarth, just to kind of, as a thing I read and towards the end of the suit, there's a very clear, like almost like a statement, not a statement, a text that really talks about how making of this particular book helped you to process a lot of your own positions internally about the world and the injustices, and especially coming from your own what you state yourself as a privileged position, which was very specific, because I think it almost looked like as if it's the process through which you undid a lot of otherwise kind of approaches that we kind of go about when we do go about as creators. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So yeah, I mean, I think I completely resonate with what Ita said as well about silence weighing on you a lot more, especially when you're someone who is radicalized. It's very difficult for you to just walk around saying that, hey, I'm really radical, but I don't put this into practice at all. Neither do I really think about this otherwise. It's the idea of being radical is to constantly evolve your politics enough to be able to understand how the personal plays into it as well, right? I think for me, it was bound to be a learning journey, because when I sense the kind of violence Safai Karamcharis and manual scavengers face, one option is to say that, sure, I will be silent about this and someone else will come and tell the story whenever it has to be told. The other option is to tell the story, and I know that it might not be I'm not the ideal voice to be able to carry that story forward, but what is it that prevents a Savarna author from being able to speak about caste? I feel like in the anti-caste organization that we had on campus, the first thing that we were trying to establish was that to be able to annihilate caste, you need to speak about caste. And it can't be, I mean, I feel like in my own personal politics, there's an understanding that, and this is something that you come to after like lots and lots of hours that you spend breaking your head on the same thing, of action or not action sort of problem. But essentially it's the idea that how do I put it? Right, as a Savarna author, I guess it's much easier to say that the problem of speaking about caste must entirely lie with Dalit Bahujan audiences. And that is not how you annihilate caste. That is, I mean, they are the ones who are the victims of it, but unless the oppressors also are able to acknowledge the position and weight they hold, and that comes with the fact that in stating it, you are occupying weight and you are occupying a space. Now, it depends on which publisher I approach. I mean, how much of a Brahminical capital benefit do I assimilate from that statement or from that action? And every action has causality, right? You need to, I mean, like, and I think as belonging to a history of privilege, to a history of being from a class and caste and gender of oppression, every action is political, and you stand with that weight and you stand strongly and believe in the future that you believe in, and extend solidarity when there is space that has to be made. You'll be the first person to back down and say that, you know what, this is not my mic to hold and this is not my space to be able to occupy. I think it's also understanding that, I mean, the space of comics, as we were discussing earlier, how radical has that space been able to be, as in like, how much, I mean, it holds immense potential to be radical, but is the comic medium in India really radical enough? Have we been able to create those structures of whether it's circulation, whether it's access, whether it's language and translation? And Yogesh Maitre speaks fabulously about the politics of translation as well. But knowing how accessible comics as a medium is, how much have we, as progressives, been able to like build on that potential is something that even I'm working on. Like I'm trying to figure out and build. So it's a process of constant churning, I think. In every radical step there is growth, and in every radical step you acknowledge that reality that you're trying to embrace, and you try your best not to believe yourself to be the proprietor of history, and neither do you believe yourself to be the liberator of oppressed classes and castes, but you do your best, I guess.
Can I add something from the context of my work? So the reason I felt quite comfortable to work on this subject, even though I have friends who were in the movement who lived there quite literally. And I would go and come when I could, and kind of stay in touch with people who were there. But was that when I went and actually started talking to people, they wanted this story to be told. They wanted the farm laws to be critiqued. They wanted people to actually talk about what they were saying and put their ideas across. So I felt quite comfortable, because I think, of course, initially there was a lot of hesitation, because when you enter a space like that, which has been vilified by the media, then there is a little bit of doubt. But if you make an effort to speak to people and genuinely engage with what they're saying, and have conversations, and and actually give them the support that they needed at that time, because I know that when I went there, people were like, why aren't people from Delhi coming? And there are many people who did not go. So I felt, and they said, please tell people why we're here. So in that sense, I think it's very specific to the context that you're working on. And I think that, and it really depends on the nature of the project, and what people who you're speaking about have actually told you.
Also, when we were speaking the other day, you did tell me about the fact that how speaking to them in Punjabi was very different as opposed to like you speaking to them in Hindi, because the comfort level of somebody who is speaking Punjabi to them was very different in terms of the stories that they would like to open up and tell. And also it brought something within you as a kind of I would not say cathartic response, but some sense of sensation to be able to go and feel the need to actually make the narrative, just to kind of add to the.
Yeah. I mean, just to, we did speak about that. My Punjabi is not very good. Okay, it's getting better. I'm taking classes, in fact, after this movement, so that I can kind of improve and have better conversations. But I did make an attempt, and I think that was very well received. People appreciated that, even if it was like the pronunciation was off and all, which it is still kind of. I did learn Gurmukhi while the protest was on, so I could read the signs and find my way around, because it was literally like a parallel city that had come up. So you had to find your way around. One way to do that was to learn the script. And that did get a good response from people, and I do understand a fair amount, so I was able to understand some of the metaphors, and it did help to be able to get a sense of the idioms that are being spoken, when you're doing those interviews, even if you do respond in Hindi. So that did make a difference and did make a connect, which was very nice to feel, especially because, as I mentioned when I was speaking about the protests in the 80s in Calcutta, I had been, as someone who lived in Delhi, quite aware of the anti-minority sentiment that is there in this country, and then to be able to go and connect with people who are in protest, who share not the same identity but similar identity as you, well, it did mean something personally.
Ikroop, I want you to talk about a little about how was it to reapproach the life of a revolutionary leader, and also somewhere to demystify it for yourself and to get into the nuance of it, and at the same time come from that arc to getting quite, as you said, radicalized of engaging with the farmers movement? And how did that kind of energies, which I believe have some sense of coexistence, have worked through for you personally?
Gosh, that's an intense question. Mopi's asking intense questions. Bhagat's, yes, I'm on a first name basis. I've just become very familiar with him, so it feels like almost like a younger brother, even though he wouldn't. He feels like a younger brother, even though he wouldn't be. As I was reading about that particular history and researching and diving deep, a lot of questions that I had not asked my family, or things that we didn't discuss openly, they kind of bubbled to the surface. One of the terms that kept coming up again and again was Khalistan, when the farmers were labeled Khalistani. So I kind of started having that conversation with my parents, and my father was in the army. So he's not, I wouldn't say he's brainwashed into being patriotic, but he has a sense of duty that he feels he's bound to this country in a way which I don't feel the same. So when Khalistan would come up, I could see them visibly kind of, withdraw from the conversation. And I said, why don't we talk about it? It's like, oh my God, no, we can't talk about Bhindranwale. He's like the villain of the villains, and no conversation around that. I said, yeah, but we talk about 84 all the time, and 84 is connected to Bhindranwale. It's connected to the emergency. It's connected to farm laws, agricultural production. So why not? So my mother said to me, oh my God, she's become very radicalized. I can't talk to her anymore. And that's when I realized that something in my mind had shifted, because I had been reading about this thread that now clearly connected all the incidents of supposed terrorism that have happened and activities. The Naxal movement became very apparent. The leftist movement in Punjab kind of emerged in my consciousness. It had not been. A lot of Punjabis were involved in the Naxal movement. So it was kind of remarkable that I had been so ignorant. I had assumed I knew enough, that I had studied and I had been taught these things, but not really. Is the mic still okay? Yeah, I don't know how to go into all the details of this journey. It feels like it's become a part of me, and it's hard to now objectively view it and like describe it. This is the best I can do.
I have many. I mean, maybe everyone spoke loud enough. Can use that one.
I have many more questions, but I think you've been very patient. We can take some questions from the audience, if any pressing questions for the people in the, yes.
Well, I'm deeply educated. There's long experience of understanding where we've been going since comic book days. Just want to ask the four young artists here, have you acquainted yourself with the picture storytellers in this country, the Oppars or the Patuas or the miniaturists? There are many. There are about 8 or 9 traditions that are without words. They have words, but they sing them out. They write the lyrics, but they sing them out. And they tell stories, not from page to page, but in different formats, which doesn't have a clear narrative, page to page, but does tell stories and captures the imagination of hundreds and thousands of people in this country. Have you touched base with any of them? Okay, so I'd love to, because I personally see as a My name is Rajiv Sethi. I work a lot in this field over the last 5 decades, 3 decades of which I've had the pleasure of knowing Arijit. But I do think that an energy such as yours, which has drawn the contemporary narrative from your very personal and your inspirational journeys, could do huge things as designers like us used to in way back in the 70s and 80s, working with craftspeople to help them find another voice. And sometimes those voices, in fact, most of the time, those voices taught us more than we could give them. And I just think that energies like yours, if they're able to come into the mainstream, and I have to call that the mainstream because clearly this is not. From the little that I've experienced today, clearly this is not the mainstream. Although you are touching, you're drinking of the same river. But because of words, because of publishing, because of the medium, it goes away into the hands of those who don't know better. So what is the chance of some of you being drawn to this as artists, as independent thinkers, to work with communities that have done nothing but this from generation to generation? It's a question I open to all 4 of you.
Go ahead. So if I understood the question correctly, is the openness that we as artists have to be able to connect with the long tradition and culture of picture storytelling, as you mentioned. And I think, yeah, as in like there is immense urgency, I think, for us to be able to even take those steps forward, to be able to, I mean, and we are speaking about the margins, right? And the margins are where, at least I can speak for myself, the preoccupations that I have come from the margins. And sure, one of the things that you're suggesting definitely makes sense. But in fact, I was more interested in understanding what the idea of bringing it into the mainstream is, right? Because that's something that we were speaking about. When we document such stories, which sure, as in like when we speak about whether it's Bastar, whether it's Kashmir, whether it's caste in India, whether it's, I mean, the farmers' movement, whether it's historical or contemporary movements, it's also something for us to try figuring out the medium that we're working with, specifically comics. How is that monopoly in some sense being limited in its variety and distribution by the mainstream, which is something that I've been thinking about, and I'd be very open to understanding what your perspective on this is.
It's to do transdisciplinary pedagogy. You were schools where you were put into silos. The writer, painter, theatre artist. While most of these artists and communities I talk about,
Right.
you know the difference.
Right.
You could be singing your story. You could be actually finding the lyrics that would marry your picture. It comes without any effort.
Yeah.
If you sit with these communities, you know that there's great strength in storytelling in this country.
I wanted to
Reach
also
out to millions more than you ever will.
Yeah, I was thinking also about as you said, as creative practitioners, artists, we're also not often working in one capacity. So, for instance, I do create graphic narratives, but in my case, I also run this NGO, which is called Outreach India, and we work within that. There are artists from various disciplines who've done, their courses in photography or film, and they've come out of 4 years, 6 years of design. but want to work with communities and are aware. And often there are artists who are sensitive to, the understanding that there are other practices in India, in the country, and do want to engage with communities, especially in these 2 lockdown years. There is an awareness of the fact that there's, increasing inequality. How do you work with not just traditional communities of artists, but also with schools that are rural, going away from just that bubble of privilege? So there's these 2 different, there's of course the rural artisan community, but it's also schools and other education efforts. So, I mean, in this, in my capacity, and I know with other artists, there is this inclination and ability to do more than one thing. And I think that's also an interesting way of thinking about what professions are, because as you're saying, we're often urged to do and be one single thing. And being creative and thinking that ways is also a push away from being a single occupation labeled to oneself. And so, within the organization, within Outreach, that's been an opportunity for me to be able to engage with craft people who have come into Delhi, who are at who not even just coming to Delhi, but who we're in touch with through somebody else, and bring them and have workshops with them. So it may not be only about comics. As artists, one is able to think creatively and occupy oneself in different ways. So there's been, that has been my engagement, to be able to also step outside, say, just comics making as a creative practitioner. It shouldn't mean only one thing. One has to creatively think of various ways of working. And also education spaces within the country, because there are so many rural schools doing really interesting things apart from the collapse of the government school system. So I think that's there. And also I wanted to add, in terms of like the ethics question also comes in here, of what happens to a graphic narrative with, I do think that it is a niche audience, but there can be efforts to break that, and even small efforts. So I was, sorry?
I'm sure.
Okay, I don't know how to think. But
but I wish I could sing. That would be wonderful.
I'm just sorry to take this long actually, but I would welcome all of your those. I'd be very happy to perhaps with your help and the help of all the NGOs that you run, organize one of your own communities from various parts of the country. One who teaches to each other could come together with you. So that very happy to work with this. Because of that, just carry on.
Any other questions? I want to ask you, see, my understanding, I may be wrong here, but a lot of times when we are doing something true for independent, radical, whatever that may mean, is trying to break away from the mainstream issues that the mainstream may not be interested, using a medium which is obviously not mainstream, things like that. So both in terms of our approach, how we put it together, in terms of our intent, in terms of the form and content, blah, blah, blah. So for good or ill, we find a lot of things in India that we are sort of, whatever you want to call, duplicating what is already, for example, this Bhagat Singh, I've not read the book, so just seen a little bit what you've shown here. And I'm sure you may have looked at that or wrestled with these issues yourself. I just want to know what your thoughts are. You see, at one time, till say about 30 years back, because you had Sukhdev, Rajguru, Bhagat Singh, all three, caught for the same thing, working for the same purpose. They did the same thing. They tried together, housed in the same jail. Everything happened together. It was like a collective thing, and then hanged same place, cremated same. It was impossible for you to name one. It was always used to be, the way we say Sitaram, Siaram. It used to be at the time before the Jai Shri Ram, it used to be that you said Sita and Lord Rama, both names used to come together. So it was like that kind of thing. And it has just gone away. And if they are like, they don't exist at all now. Right now, you see the publicity Delhi government is doing. You do not have even a single college named after Rajguru or Sukhdev anywhere in India, and it's as if they don't exist at all. Okay. And you would be hard pressed. I mean, the details of Bhagat Singh in two not so well made Bollywood movies, Manoj Kumar's movie made long time back, much substantial in that sense. People would not know Rajguru's second name and family name and all of that. So there's a certain injustice there, and they are very strong. What you try to point out, this whole trying to appropriate him by left and right. It certainly serves vested interests of different types. It is most people don't know that when this thing had happened, this Jallianwala Bagh, the people who were running the clergy, Sikhs who were, you didn't have SGPC back then, but their predecessor had felicitated Daniel Dyer. They brought him to Golden Temple and they said, we'll make you honorary Sikh. And, it's a real wretched kind of story which is there, which has been completely buried. Bhagat Singh, there I think just about 4 pictures we have of him, and of which I think there's just one where he's got a turban, but we have installed that on him.
3 he has a turban, 1 he doesn't.
Okay, I stand corrected. So, things like that. Till the very end, when they tried to make him go back to religion, he said that even if there is a divine, I'm not interested. It'd be very cowardly for me to do that. And if you see the Sikh museum they have in Rakabganj Gurudwara, they have tried to falsify that. And there's so much of falsehood attached to that whole thing. And in a way, you are contributing to that injustice in some manner by choosing a certain idea there. Yeah. Have you thought of that at all? What is your take on this?
I mean, if you read the book, clearly I show the journey that Bhagat took in being an Arya Samaji. His family was Arya Samaji, but Sikh, they identified also as Sikh. To like him becoming a radical atheist. And so there is no room for religion eventually in his life. He's completely disassociated himself. He was upset with any leader who brought up any kind of religious emotion into his speeches. In fact, he had a falling out with Lala Lajpat Rai in the last days of Lala Lajpat Rai's life, because he had gone back to the Hindu Mahasabha movement, and Bhagat and the rest of HSRA were very disappointed. But regardless of their disappointment, they were angry when he was beaten and eventually died of those beatings. And the murder happened as a retaliation to Lala Lajpat Rai's death. So there was a sense of kind of allowance also, but the conversation shouldn't stop. I think that was Bhagat's like entire being that was invested in. The debate needs to continue regardless of you disagreeing with me. When we stop talking, that is the problem. So he consistently wanted to talk to Gandhi. He kept trying to get appointments with, can I get a face-to-face appointment? And he didn't get that eventually because Gandhi labeled him a terrorist and didn't want to taint his image of being a non-violent leader, which somewhere is right. But debate needs to continue. You can't like shut people down. That is what the current, I think the entire conversation is, that dissent needs, whether you are right or wrong, that's irrelevant, but conversations need to happen between the supposed rights and the wrongs for it to, for some solution to emerge. And you're right about Rajguru and Sukhdev not being given their due. And this is a question that I've grappled with, and a few people have asked me this question. And my response to that question was that it is an unjust thing that has happened, not just to them, but thousands of young men who were hanged. We don't know their names. And it's remarkable that we know Bhagat's name. And I feel that's only because of his writings that he left behind. He wrote extensively. So a lot of his articles were published in newspapers. And during the trial period, when he spoke in court and argued his case, that is when the press picked up on his intellectual rigor and capacity and capabilities. And they kind of wrote about him. And it kind of just organically, he became this name very organically. And it's right, Sukhdev was an intellectual as well, but he wasn't as visible because he didn't leave behind that kind of some kind of supporting documents that would help you kind of be projected into the larger consciousness. Also, I feel that Bhagat is still appropriated by the Sikh community, even though he turned atheist. And that is also one reason why he's remained in the consciousness, because the Sikh community kind of backs him up. And I wish Sukhdev and Rajguru got the same kind of impetus from their communities, because at the same time, they belonged somewhere and we want them to belong somewhere, and they come from certain identities. It would be good to, have that kind of dialogue around that. You're right, though. They have not been given their due, and many, many, many others, not just them.
This is just to kind of say thank you to all of you. I mean, particularly the illustrators, the translators, the keynote speaker today, the panelists, amazing panel that we had. Thank you, everyone. Audience, I mean, thanks so much. I mean, a lot of them also kind of left because we are getting late. But thank you so much for coming, and it was really a great evening. And we will also kind of like to thank Henry Paul Foundation for their support for this work and this meeting. So thank you all. It was a lovely evening, and please join us for the tea outside. Thank you. I hope you have collected your copy of comic, otherwise it's outside.